Ladies and gentlemen, we resume the sitting. The minutes of yesterday's session and the adopted texts are available. Are there any comments? If that's not the case, the minutes stand adopted. And now we have on the agenda the debate on the situation in Syria. There will be a statement by the Vice President of the Commission, the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. Lady Ashton, you have the floor.
Mr. President, thank you, and may I thank honourable members very much for the slightly earlier start for this debate. Honourable members, on the 21st of August 2013, we saw chemical weapons used to kill hundreds of people in Syria. This is a war crime, a crime against humanity, and runs contrary to all the values of the international community. We have had extensive discussions, both within the ministers' meeting in Vilnius, where we were joined by both Elmar Brok in his capacity as chair of the AFET committee, and I thank him for his attendance, and by Secretary Kerry, who came to an extraordinary part of the meeting to talk with us about Syria and about events in the region. We agreed there and then that a strong international response was needed in the face of this crime, and that we have to prevent impunity and prevent creating a horrific precedent for the use of chemical weapons. Of course, we are now paying great attention to the developments that are following hour by hour, with the Russian proposal built on the words of Secretary Kerry and obviously discussions that took place in St. Petersburg, namely to put Syria's chemical weapons under international surveillance. But I will come back to that, if I may, in a moment, because I also think we need to remember the broader picture of what is happening in Syria. In these past weeks, we have witnessed yet another round of spiralling violence in the country. The regime has stepped up its military campaign against the opposition-held areas, sometimes taking recourse to indiscriminate shelling of entire neighbourhoods. We have seen deeply disturbing reports of increased violence along confessional and ethnic lines, attacks against the Alawi population at the hands of extremist rebel groups, followed by a harsh response from the regime. Some Christian communities have been targeted recently. And in the northeast, intensive fighting involving the Syrian Kurds lasted for weeks and resulted in increased refugee flows to Iraq. I want to commend the UN investigation mission for engaging in their field inquiry into the attack of the 21st of August with courage and speed in what was very obviously an extremely difficult security situation. It is now of the utmost importance that they complete their report as soon as possible, that the work going on in laboratories in Sweden and Finland and elsewhere gives us the information confirmed through these reports that is already established through other reports that many member states and international partners have been engaged in. We have seen that there is an assessment coming forward that only the regime possesses chemical agents and the means of their delivery in sufficient quantity to have done the attack on the 21st of August. It is really important that we recognise that information as well. And the conclusion that so many have already reached, that therefore the regime was behind the attack and that they have given support to an international response by force, given, of course, what is happening in terms of the blockage in the Security Council. We have consistently emphasised the need for the efforts in the Security Council to come to fruition, to try and effectively end this conflict. I say again that the role of the Security Council is crucial and irreplaceable, but it does rely on the members of the Security Council taking their responsibilities, and it is deeply regrettable that they have not yet shouldered that responsibility with regard to this conflict. Internationally, we work with all partners, with the United States, with Russia, with the UN, with many Arab nations, to achieve a united international response in the light of the developments that we see taking place in Syria now. I've already referred to the meeting in Vilnius, where we found common language from all EU 28 member states. Some had already signed up to the language of the G20, and some might argue that our language is not quite the same. But I think we formulated a substantial EU position. The condemnation of the chemical attack, the recognition of the evidence of the regime's responsibility, the necessity for the international community to respond, and a strong call on the Security Council to fulfil its responsibilities. The emphasis which has been made consistently by all that I've spoken to on a political solution and support for what has become known as a Geneva II initiative, and our commitment to providing aid on a continuing basis now and into the future. Let me say a little bit more about these recent developments, which, as I say, are continuing hour by hour to be developed. Russia has proposed putting the Syrian chemical weapons arsenal under international control and destroying it eventually. We see that the Syrian Foreign Minister, Mr. Moallem, when he was in Moscow, welcomed this proposal. And the Secretary-General is urging the Security Council along these lines. Support is coming from many different directions. I think it's very important to take this momentum and to use it, because what we're seeing for the first time in a long time is the international community uniting towards an action on Syria. But as honourable members will be the first to say, we need to approach this with care and examine the developments in detail. First of all, to ensure that the Syrian regime not only says it will agree to international action, but it must do so quickly, fully and without conditions, to follow up with transparency and to make sure that it adheres to all the requirements. It needs to be a different response, in other words, from the response we've had in the past. Broken promises, obstacles put in the way of international efforts. Honourable members, we've discussed many times the fact that ultimately there has to be a political solution that can deliver the Syrian people from this traumatic experience, from the suffering, from the ruin of the country and of the people, and the total disregard we see so often for human rights. It's extremely important that the plight of the refugees is not ignored, and that we continue to find not only ways of putting more resources at the disposal of the refugee population, but of finding better and smarter and quicker ways to provide the resources that are needed, especially to the people who are suffering inside the country. And those honourable members who have talked with the UN or talked with our Commissioner Georgieva on this subject, or the people who are going in to Syria on a regular basis, will know just how complex it is to try and move support, medical aid and supplies, food and so on across parts of the country, many of which are held by different groups in a very difficult situation. We, of course, continue, by the way, to send in missions on a regular basis to Syria. The latest development, therefore, that we have is an opportunity to reinvigorate not just trying to sort out the chemical weapons issue, but the broader political dimension. And I hope that we will seize the opportunity to try and urge all to do this. We know that tomorrow Secretary Kerry will meet with Minister Lavrov in Geneva to try and work up exactly what this initiative might mean, to get into the detail of what would have to happen when and how and by whom. And we put the EU at the disposal of the work that is ongoing in order to see how we can contribute, not if, but how. But it's also important to try and move ahead and get this peace process moving. Honourable members will no doubt in the course of your deliberations argue that the threat of strikes has been the most important element in bringing the initiative to the table that can try and tackle chemical weapons. Whatever your view, the reality is that this is a moment to try and pull towards the process that is so necessary to find the political solution. And we need to engage with all partners, as we are doing, to find ways to achieve that. We will continue to work to that end. But I've also mentioned the ongoing humanitarian disaster. We've already provided €1.3 billion between the institutions of the European Union and Member States. But honourable members will know too that the UN estimates that much, much more is going to be needed, and we need to prepare for the end of this conflict and the rebuilding of a nation which by many figures is 70% or so destroyed, not to mention the lives of people that have been destroyed, people who have been killed, children who have been orphaned, people who have been badly injured and maimed. There is a huge amount that is going to be necessary to do. So we have to reaffirm our commitment to the people of Syria, to support them in every way possible through our humanitarian aid, to support them in a political process that can try and bring peace, to do that by being prepared to work out on the ground how that can happen, place by place, as well as across the whole nation, being able and willing to support the moves to get rid of the chemical weapons, and being prepared to work with our international partners in a process that can make the Security Council do its work, but also ensure that we respond to the challenge as well. Honourable members, I hope the resolution that you will put forward will be able to help and support the work that is ongoing by the European Union to do that, and I thank you for it.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much for this statement, Lady Ashton. On behalf of the groups, we now have the first speaker, Mr. Salafranca.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President, High Representative, distinguished members. The crisis in Syria underscores, on the one hand, how the external action of the European Union is insufficient despite the Lisbon Treaty, despite your efforts, Baroness Ashton, and despite the conclusions of the informal meeting in Vilnius last weekend. And this also underlines quite dramatically how the United Nations is irrelevant, is not able to respond through its organs, through its structure, to the charter by which it was founded. This means basically that al-Assad and his allies have the upper hand for the time being, and secondly, that there's an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe for the people of Syria. It seems now that there's a diplomatic initiative to bring chemical weapons under international control and to destroy them. That's most welcome, but it should be done through an urgent, binding resolution. And in the event of that not being fulfilled, Chapter 7 of the United Nations should be applied. However, this initiative, Lady Ashton, does leave one question open, and that is this. Will all of these efforts enable or allow the al-Assad regime to go on slaughtering its people with using conventional weapons? A UN resolution creating a humanitarian corridor and bringing about an aerial exclusion zone would be very positive. So, Lady Ashton, we are spending large sums of money on our renewed Mediterranean policy, and our near neighbourhood policy situation could not be more appalling. Of course, it doesn't depend solely on us, but I think that over and above mobilising significant resources, as is required by the situation, we need to try to speak with one single voice. And definitely, Lady Ashton, we should try to have a greater impact on this political scene. So I'll wind up, President, by asking Lady Ashton if she can do something to ensure that the 7 people who have been taken hostage in the Ashraf camp 6 of whom are women, to prevent their being tortured and executed as others have been. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Swoboda.
High Representative, what do we know? We know that chemical weapons have been used. That's very clear. We have many documents, many conclusions that show that there's a direct or at least an indirect responsibility of the Assad regime for this attack. I cannot imagine that this could have happened without the knowledge of Assad. The international community must react to prevent another action and use of chemical weapons. That is our right, it is our obligation. Furthermore, threats of military action have been expressed. There are many colleagues, and we discussed this long in our group, who have been for or against military action, but the threats are here and the threats helped. That we have to confess. Because Russia would not have moved without the threats, and Assad would have moved without the threats. But now we have to act, and we have to demand from Syria to follow with action against promises and words. Syria has to sign up the Chemical Weapons Convention now. Syria has to hand over all chemical weapons, and I say all chemical weapons, which have to be destructed and destroyed under UN control. This, of course, is not the end of the peace. No, it's the beginning. And we need the Geneva conference we have planned so long already for a sincere dialogue. And we have to challenge Russia, Syria, Iran and others to come forward also with some offers for peace and a political solution. And of course, finally, also speaking about many issues, we very often forget the many refugees, the million of refugees, where Europe and all our member states have to do more. It's not enough what we did. And finally, we have a lot of talk of military action. I don't want to go into detail. And as I said, the threats have been helpful. But now it's time for peace. Now we have to say, and this can be the big role of Europe, let's give peace a chance in Syria and the Middle East. Thank you.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Mr. Verhofstadt.
This is my fourth or fifth debate with Mrs. Ashton on Syria. And as you know, Ms. Ashton, I'm asking already 2 years ago for a more bolder approach of Syria and eventually to use force to end this tragedy in Syria. And I continue on that line. It's going worse and worse. We have now 2 million refugees, we have 6 million of displaced people inside Syria, we have 100,000 of people killed, and we have the use of chemical weapons now. And there is no doubt that it is the Assad regime who used this. There is a Human Rights Watch report that has been published 2 days ago, and that clearly indicating that only the Assad regime has the 330mm rockets and the 140mm artillery rockets that have been used in the attack. Only them, not the opposition. So there is no doubt, and all this discussion on who did it is in fact something that is clear now. So the question is now what we do. What I hear is a one-track approach. Okay, we have to stop this use of chemical weapons, and this is true. And then the question is over. This afternoon I want to ask and to say very clearly, we need a two-track approach. We need first of all to end the use of chemical weapons, and therefore we have this possibility maybe to put them under the control of the international community, but that's only possible if that is not a trap, if that is not what I should call a delaying tactics, a way for the Assad regime to gain again, to strengthen his army and to gain again a number of months. And to be sure of that, I hope that we can be sure of that tomorrow when Kerry is meeting Lavrov. I should be very pleased if you were there too, as the representative of the Europeans. and that is not only a question of discussion between the Russians and the Americans. But you have to be sure, and that's what I'm asking you, to have a clear indication already tomorrow if yes or no that is serious and there can be on a short-term basis an implementation of that proposal. If it is not possible within in a few days or weeks, then it's not serious, then it's really a way to help Assad. And the second thing is, don't forget the real problem in Syria, the tragedy, the ongoing tragedy. That's the second track. And I'm continuing to say to you and to the Europeans and to everybody, we need a non-fly zone. We know what we need. If Assad can continue to use his airplanes, his helicopters, his missiles and his airports for that, this slaughter of the Syrian population shall simply continue. And you know, that's the best way also to have a political deal. How you want that he makes a political deal if there is no pressure behind it, if there is no stick behind it? Carrots need sticks, certainly in diplomacy and in international politics. So the idea, the second track, and I have the impression that the Americans are completely not even considering the second track for the moment. How to put pressure again on the Assad regime so that he can accept a political solution. And I conclude with that. A political solution, in my opinion, Mrs. Ashton, is a solution without Assad and without the Assad family. Yes, with the Alawite community, that's obvious naturally, but without Assad and the Assad family.
Danke für die Grünen, Frau Lunacek.
Thank you very much. And next, on behalf of the Greens, Mrs. Lunacek. Thank you, President, Lady Ashton. I think we all agree, and have been for some time, that this horrific murdering in Syria must end, and one should never ever again use chemical weapons. In my group, we've had debates as to what reaction should be taken, because I think we need a strong reaction, but at the same time we have to ask ourselves whether some kind of military action in fact achieves what we want. That is, that we protect the people. And I doubt that, and so do many others. But now there is a window of opportunity. Fortunately, the parliaments also in the UK and London have taken a first step to open this window opportunity. It's 48 hours where we have time to debate what we can do with the regime, together with Russia, with the support of the international community. And Iran has also said they want to have control of the chemical weapons and remove. There is the possibility of a diplomatic solution, but we cannot just delay matters needlessly. The best thing would be to have a Geneva II, and I think that Iran should be included as an important regional actor. And I'm very happy that in the common resolution we have the possibility that if the Security Council is blocked, that the General Assembly takes up a debate and takes a decision that will give some kind of legitimacy under international law. And I think that if the Security Council remains blocked, we should look at that possibility. And finally, something important, that's the refugees. If there is a diplomatic solution, then the suffering of the refugees, the millions of men, women and children who are already under pressure, who have been injured, who had to leave their homes, they must also find a political solution there. And we must do more to help the refugees. Only half the 3.3 million euros have been paid out, and member states should in fact be prepared to take on more refugees. It's not enough just to say that the neighbors can do what is necessary. This is something that we in the member states in the Union feel should be obliged to help these people out.
Meyer.
Thank you very much. Mr. Willy Meyer.
Excuse me. Mr. Tannock, yes.
Mr. President, Madam High Representative, Syria remains the most pressing challenge to international peace and security, with more than 100,000 dead and 2 million refugees. and now the alleged horrific use by the Assad's regime of sarin gas on the 21st of August. This violates customary international law under the 1925 Geneva Gas Protocol and rightly demands a robust response by the international community. I too suggested a no-fly zone as the only way to deter further use of chemical weapons and force Assad back to the negotiating table, as a limited surgical strike now is likely to be mainly hitting empty buildings. The ECR Group welcomes the newest proposals on the table from President Obama to drop its very effective military strike in exchange for a handover and destruction of Syrian weapons of mass destruction. The fact that Russia and Iran have readily accepted this suggestion and proposal is to me suggestive of an admission that the Ba'athist Syrian regime ally, their Ba'athist regime ally, actually possesses chemical weapons, in spite of the fact that Assad's regime, until right to the last minute, attempted to deny the fact they even owned the things in the first place, and this atrocious use by them against his own people. This new diplomatic solution raises many challenges, not least verification and trust in a totalitarian regime not known for acting in good faith, and the fact they may well try and conceal some of the chemical weapons stockpile. And this doesn't solve the problem, of course, of impunity for war crimes already clearly carried out by both sides. Neither does it ensure a return to Geneva II and a political settlement in which Assad and his family depart and a new democratically elected government emerges. President Obama has made it clear if this latest proposal fails, he reserves the right to use the US military to act surgically and appropriately to deter future use of gas against civilians, but also, of course, against troops in conflict everywhere, which would bring back the horrors and memories of the First World War. Lastly, I deplore the cynical use to date by Russia and China in the UN Security Council in preventing a politically imposed solution to this terrible crisis. Thank you.
Danke, Herr Tannock. Nun
Thank you. Mr. Meyer.
Thank you very much, President. Mrs. Ashton. At the Interparliamentary Security Conference in Vilnius, you already heard my group say that we are against the drama of this civil war and we are against all forms of intervention. We have to seek a political, regional solution, always under the aegis of the United Nations Charter, not outside the UN. In February 2003, Colin Powell made this point at the Security Council. He was then Secretary of State. Nothing outside the framework of the United Nations. This in the context of Saddam Hussein and chemical weapons there. It's the same with this regime. We require, we demand an independent investigation. It has to be done by the UN. The use of chemical weapons is an international crime, but nothing should be ruled out. The Saudi Arabian connection, for example. We don't want another illegal, illicit war on the basis of intelligence information that is leaked internationally. You see, any intervention outside the framework of the UN would be a return to barbarism. And if there's any region of the world that should make the point that we need to work within the framework of the UN, it's Europe. Look at World Wars I and II. Europe needs to lead an international convention putting a use to the end of all forms of such weapon, chemical, bacteriological and nuclear. Thank you.
ich habe eine blaue Karte.
We have a blue card. Colleague.
Card for you. Do you accept it? Mr. Lambsdorff.
Yes, a couple of things. Colleague, do you agree that Colin Powell is no longer Secretary of State of the US? We have actually had a change of government and we have a different administration. That's my first question. Secondly, do you recognize that Human Rights Watch has already produced a detailed investigation, as we heard from Lady Ashton, which clearly states that the regime were responsible for the attacks and that we are dealing with chemical weapons? In other words, it doesn't really make sense to delay things any further, and this can only serve the interests of Moscow.
Thank you very much. You may not think it's significant that a Secretary of State of the United States should appear at the supreme organ, the Security Council of the United Nations, to show the entire world that there was proof incriminating Saddam Hussein. It's the same administration of the same country. Okay, it's a different party now, but it's the same intelligence services. It's the same intelligence services behind this who are spying against European citizens too. Look at the scope they have. And lastly, yes, that's right, and also spying on journalists in the field. You don't read what the journalists say because you're not interested, but there are journalists, including BBC journalists, who've interviewed victims and families and have said the Saudi Arabian intelligence services gave us chemical products. I could show you plenty of photos.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Farage.
I represent a group that is against military action in Syria. We're against it not because we're pacifist. We're against it not because we don't care about the awful things going on there. We're against it because we think there's some pretty poor thinking going on. This idea that somehow the rebels are the good guys and Assad are the bad guys really is oversimplifying a situation where, of course, we know that Al-Qaeda have significant representation amongst those rebel groups. And, of course, we've seen it all before. An endless series of military adventures over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, one of which, of course, notably in Afghanistan, is still going on and is not achieving any of the original aims. And I was worried when I heard the Americans telling us to begin with it was about punishing Assad, and then within a week it was about regime change, a position that I know the noble Baroness herself supports. We think firing 1,000 cruise missiles in is likely to make an unstable situation even worse than it is now. But of course, Baroness Ashton, in a sense, you're sitting pretty, because as the highest paid female politician in the world, luckily you've got a non-job, because the EU, thank goodness, hasn't yet got a foreign policy. And as a result of that, what we saw 2 weeks ago in the House of Commons was a nation-state democracy standing up and saying something. And as a direct result of that vote in the House of Commons, we have not gone to war in Syria. We have entered a period of negotiations, and Assad has a chance to prove to all of us whether he's a good man or a bad man. I don't know how this will play out, but at least, Mr. Verhofstadt, there is a chance of peace. And I know that you represent the kind of political class who believe that global influence can only be achieved through bombing. Well, luckily, unlike extreme EU nationalists like yourself, British democracy has proved that through nation-state parliaments, we've actually made people rethink. And Mr. Chairman, I have to say, Mr. Chairman, that as somebody that has been here now for 14 years, it's very ironic that the view that I used to represent was called extreme, but you can see the extreme militarists now. Thank you.
So, I have 2 blue cards. Do you accept it? Ich nehme keine mehr, bitte.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Tannock has a question. You have the floor, Mr. Tannock.
Nigel, Mr. Farage, over here. You talked about the good guys and the bad guys. It's not about the good guys and the bad guys. You remember well the battlefields of the First World War. You take a great interest in that war, and you remember the horrors of the use of gas. Would you not accept that a red line has been crossed by the Assad regime in using gas against his own people? And if so, what should be done to stop other dictators and despots using it elsewhere, not just against civilians, but actually in military conflict? So what would your response be to the use of a weapon of mass destruction? Sit back and do nothing?
Danke.
The good guys, bad guys story, really I take from your own Foreign Secretary and party member William Hague, who of course was urging the international community to arm the rebels, something that struck me, given we know Al-Qaeda's involvement, as being total and utter madness. I am cynical and sceptical, as are much of the European public, about who has used those weapons until we get the full report and we get the intelligence right. We went to war in Iraq We went to war in Iraq being told that Saddam had weapons of... Why don't you shut up and listen for a change? You really must be the vilest, rudest man in European politics. And you rant on, and the chair lets you get away with it because you're the former Prime Minister of Belgium. Well, there we are. So, Mr. Tannock, I understand what you're saying. I understand something ghastly has happened here, but before you take military action, you need to be certain you're going to make things better and not worse.
The time is over. The blue card is one question and one answer. I have a second question from Mr. Jan Bashko. Jan Bashko.
Mr. Farage, would you stop the chronometer, please? May I address the question? Mr. Farage, I am coming from Romania and maybe living like a pig, as you described the Romanians. But in this room, in this house, I think that we have the same rights altogether. Therefore, I am asking you, you said that this is an opportunity for Assad to demonstrate whether he is a good man or a bad man. Do you think that 100,000 killed there proves him to be a good man? Because I don't. Do you?
Sir, I would say this to you. I have never described the Romanians as living like pigs. What I said was the Romanians treat their Roma minority like pigs. All right? So let's get that absolutely clear. You in your country discriminate against a large group of people in a way we have not seen in Europe since the 1930s. All right? Now look, I am not taking sides in this civil war, but I'm saying this, that whether it's through the use of gas or whether it's through the use of other forms of high explosives or bullets, there are terrible things happening in Syria. I understand that, and I agree with that. But rushing to war, as we did in Afghanistan, as we did in Iraq, was a mistake. And Mr. Cameron tried to bounce us into war, and thank goodness the House of Commons has given us pause for thought. Surely that must be a good thing.
So, meine Damen und Herren.
Ladies and gentlemen, please bear in mind that this is a debate on the statement of the Vice President of the Commission on the situation in Syria, and we should concentrate on that topic. The situation is very serious as it is. And I will now give the floor to Mr. Gollnisch. I admire the extraordinary faith of Svoboda from the Socialists, people from the Conservatives and Liberals in their official statements, as if we'd never heard any lies coming from governments, as if the Secretaries of State in America hadn't gone to Security Council of the United Nations with a pack of lies used as an excuse to strike with Hussein and now for Assad. If we hadn't already experienced lies over the Bosnian war, talking about 50,000 women supposedly raped by Serbs, the Libyan case showing the rebels against Gaddafi as democracies. We live in a world of lies from Bush, from Blair, and you've forgotten all this and you're believing everything you're told. Is fecit qui prodesse, looking for profit. So who is going to gain? Is it Assad who's going to gain? Quite clearly not. You should at least have some doubts, because I personally have been riddled with doubts since the very beginning of all of this. Elmar Brok is the next speaker.
President, Vice President, High Representative, colleagues, I would like to thank you. These are not easy times to find a unity in our foreign policy, but we have actually in this issue found a broad agreement amongst foreign ministers in Europe on Friday, and I think we have played a great role there. It has been said that the Security Council must again deal with the inspector's report, and things have become more political, but we must say weapons are always a defeat for politics. So therefore, we have reached this ultimatum. Chemical weapons, ABC weapons, should never be used. Not in Syria, in the conflict there, and the dictators of this world should realize that they cannot be used anywhere. This goes beyond the Syrian conflict. And if we can remove these weapons from international trade by taking international action, then we have issued a warning that has been refused so far, but without any conditions. All the conditions that have been set must be fully complied, and it must be done very quickly, and this would be absolutely unconditional. And I think we should develop a pressure so that we can make sure that we actually achieve a political solution to the conflict in Syria. And just one more thing. We should promote humanitarian aid. This House should be prepared to make money available for Syrian refugees, and we should help our commissioner who is responsible for that. And Mr. Farage.
Shoot each other now. That's Europe, and you have to learn that this is a great progress we have achieved in Europe.
Danke, Herr Brok. Ich habe eine.
Thank you, Mr. Brok. Mr. Liberadsky has a blue card for you. Mr. Liberadsky, you have the floor.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie przewodniczący. Gratuluję panu Brokowi, że zmienił na korzyść tę debatę.
I'd like to congratulate Mr. Brok for having amended the tone of this debate for the better. Now you referred to the matter of refugees. Should we not be having discussions with neighboring countries such as Lebanon to see what we can do to improve the fate of the refugees? Should we not be strengthening a dialogue for humanitarian reasons, but also because this could be a positive contribution to stabilizing the regional situation, and this could prevent the situation getting worse?
Mr. Brok.
Dear colleague, the European Union has done a great deal also in financial terms, but not enough yet. There's a political dimension. Jordan, Turkey and Lebanon are also politically endangered. There are destabilizations in these countries of various types. So therefore, we must provide help for these countries so that they can cope with the burden. That's in the interest of the political stability of those countries and also in the interest of the refugees there. And Europe must be prepared. Who are running for their lives should find help. Therefore, we must seriously consider how we can deal with these refugees from war in our procedures. We shouldn't be narrow-minded here. That's not worthwhile for Europe.
Es gibt eine Fülle von Fragen.
There are many questions, but I'll just take two for Mr. Brok. Mrs. Martin.
Come avevo già detto in commissione.
Well, as one says in AFET, and as Mr. Brok knows, there's a question to be asked. It is said also by an Italian journalist who has just been released in Syria. They said that the arms are being used by the rebels, not only by the rebels, but also by the rebels. And another country, there's the Selstrom, the reporter from. There's an interruption from the chair.
Gut, ich nehme die nächste Frage dazu, dann können Sie.
Right, I'll take the second question as well, and then Mr. Brok can respond to both. Mr. Mélenchon.
Micro.
Alors attendez, on va essayer de régler ça.
It seems to be working now, says the Speaker. Mr. Brok, you are a respected expert within this chamber. You said that chemical weapons should not be used. I don't think there's a single person in this hemicycle who would disagree. But the ban on chemical weapons doesn't date from 1925, as I've read all over the place, but 1993, a convention that was signed in my country. And on that occasion, not only did Syria not sign that convention, and you can see the results of their not signing today, this is a binding convention that bans the possession of chemical weapons and makes it obligatory to destroy them. Yes, I'm coming to my question. Syria didn't sign the convention, but nor did Egypt. Israel has signed it, but is not operating in consequence.
Mr. Brok.
Herr Brok, bitte.
Après, on me demande pourquoi j'interviens.
No. Herr Brok, bitte.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. Let me give you a brief answer. Of course, this is not a balanced report, but we are in a Europe of a free press. But let us make one thing clear. We must make our reporting clear. We want to have peace through political actions rather than through military threats. And otherwise we wouldn't have Russia and so on in the process. We should be aware of that. There's an international convention, yes, colleague. There's also an international legal basis. But therefore we are even more obliged to make sure that we destroy these mass destruction weapons in Syria.
Bitte, Frau Véronique de Keyser.
Mrs. de Keyser.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Having listened to the first speeches, I almost got the impression that we hadn't succeeded in having a common resolution on Syria. I think it's a good resolution, and shows that there is a consensus agreement in this hemicycle on certain specific crucial points. And there's definitely a consensus on the matter of the use of chemical weapons, as there was also an international consensus to that effect. And that needs to be underscored. It's very positive, and this goes for Iran and Russia, who were included as well. Consensus is also the key when it comes to tackling the second problem we have to look at, which is the war that is taking place in Syria, which is a civil war which is being manipulated by external protagonists. And in this case too, if we don't succeed in coming up with a political consensus, bringing together all those involved in the country, including the parties that have been excluded from government, there'll be no peace in Syria. Sometimes we launch into well-meaned speeches that are based on goodwill. But we forget that sometimes that we know from Spain that you don't emerge intact from any kind of civil war, and the danger is that Syria is going to explode into 1,000 pieces. And I think we should adopt a moderate tone vis-à-vis those who are either in government or in opposition in Syria today. Even if we think that the opposition there is also perhaps using illegal weapons to a limited extent and using torture. That's the reality in Syria, whether we like it or not. And I express the wish that this consensus on chemical weapons can be extended in political terms, and that we can remain reasonable and thus succeed in bringing the belligerent parties together around a table. One more brief word on refugees. The refugees are the third drama of Syria, and it has been rightly said that the neighbouring countries are going to explode if this goes on. So, for goodness sake, could Europe not open its arms wider? Certain countries have. Couldn't we come up with a common position? But there's been reference instead to the independence of each member state.
Thank you, Madam. Mrs. NEYTS-UYTTEBROECK.
Le haut représentant, Monsieur le Président.
Lady Ashton, President, ladies and gentlemen, the events that took place over the last weeks have brought us much information, but this is not the time to have an in-depth analysis of everything that has been done, the very many mistakes that have been made, and the loopholes in analyses. But I do hope that we will learn our lessons from all of this one day. What I want to point out today is that one has to recognize the fact that the threat of military intervention was probably the main element that started things moving in the decisive direction that is at stake. I'm not delighted about this, but that is a fact. It would probably, therefore, be dangerous to lift this threat without having a guarantee with regard to the possibilities opened by Syria, Iran and Russia. And therefore, I'm asking you, Lady Ashton, and all international players in the field to explore this approach with great perseverance, as is going to be necessary, because we're talking about perhaps something unexpected, and what we need to do is go further and find a political solution. Many other colleagues have already spoken about how we can achieve a political solution. Lady Ashton, if you follow such a political solution and path, then you will have our full support. Thank you. Mrs. FLAUTRE.
I do understand why some colleagues are passionate and excited about this, because the facts are showing that they are wrong. They tried to say that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and now the Syrian regime itself is apparently about to recognize that it has stocks of them. They tried to have us believe that there wasn't a European policy at the very time when the European policy was emerging under our very eyes, under the initiative of France and the UK and under the aegis of Baroness Ashton, who has decided to make our policy consistent and vigorous on the international scene. And people are trying to have us believe that military intervention would always be absolutely illicit at a very time when everybody understands that it's the threat of effective strikes that has opened up new doors for negotiation and for diplomacy. And I think that our responsibility as Europeans today is as shouldered by Baroness Ashton. I would congratulate you. There's an excellent compromise text, and I would congratulate the groups who have helped to draft the resolution that's up for the vote. This would show how responsible we can be in shouldering our role internationally. We don't necessarily have to choose between the military solution and the political solution. Everybody knows that the only possible solution will be a political one, but we have to find a way to articulate humanitarian assistance, a military threat, and our politico-diplomatic strategy. It is the articulation of those three strands that can give rise to a hope of putting an end once and for all to these horrors in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Piotrowski.
Użycie broni chemicznej w Syrii należy bezwzględnie.
Thank you, Mr. President. The use of chemical weapons in Syria is something we condemn, of course, and everything must be done to prevent this happening again. But are we to use arms to do this? Is death to be the response to death? As Pope Francis said, this is always a failure of mankind, and therefore it seems to me that we need to find other instruments, alternative instruments, such as putting weapons under control, international control, these weapons, the arsenal of weapons in Syria. And this solution should allow the regime to gain some time. The foreign policy of the European Union at this crucial time seems to me to lack unanimity. France in favour, Great Britain against, however, but we have to take action now.
Danke. Frau Matias.
Thank you. Mrs. Matias.
Thank you very much, President. Chemical weapons can only be condemned energetically by us all. But that doesn't mean that the solutions that have been put forward are necessarily the best ones. As has been said, we are against any external military intervention. It's not a question of time, whether today or tomorrow. It's an option that should be totally rejected. War is not the solution. It should not be allowed to sacrifice the entire people there. That's why there has to be a political solution. 100,000 dead, millions of refugees should not be converted into mere walk-on actors. We have to adopt a democratic solution with rights It's not a matter of choosing between the plague and other forms of disaster, so to speak. We need an international investigation of what took place under the aegis of the UN. How many times have we been fooled by other sources? And we also have to be against, once and for all, the civil war, the sufferings of the people. It's the people who loses. The EU can do many things. It can support refugees more than so far. It can support a political solution, and it can lead an international conference that would ensure the effective ban on the use of chemical, biological and nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Danke.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Provera. Thank you very much, President. The experience with Europe, the Arab Spring and Egypt, they show that we have some consequences that are not quite living up to what we were expecting initially. But whoever uses chemical weapons, there we need to emphasize, for example, that there are 100,000 people who died before the events of the 21st of August. So without very strong interventions from the international community, and that's why we should do something. We must make sure that democracy wins. We should perhaps not just pass power to an opposition that is not coherent, and we will see the consequences, because Syria will be constantly unstable and perhaps at the prey of Al-Qaeda. So let's move down the road of diplomacy, also drawing on the Russian proposals. Thank you very much, Mr. Borghezio.
Ragione il collega Provera.
Mr. Provera has right to pointing out what is the main element. Let me add that these horrifying winds of war, with the prospect of has actually led to a political situation that we need, where we need diplomacy. I think that the High Representative has only found 2 words to describe the problem, the position of the Christians in this country. These are also people we should be concerned about. I'm not so concerned about the refugees, but I'm sure that the members of this House who are talking about solidarity don't find it difficult to just actually take on 1 or 2 refugee families in their own homes, because, I mean, we certainly have enough income as members of this House. But let's just not use hypocrisy, let's use facts, and let's not use the majority of the parties. Thank you.
President, High Representative, there have been emotional debates on this issue of the Syrian tragedy for 2 years now, and quite rightly the tone has gone up since the 21st of August, but such emotional debate doesn't constitute a policy. And since the 21st of August, pro-military expressions, all too often unilateral, has been too much the exclusive reaction. A military intervention may be a reasonable solution, may be effective, but should always be part of a diplomatic strategy, which at the end of the day is putting forward the political solutions to the Syrian civil war. Punitive strikes promised by certain countries do not constitute a strategy. At the very best, this would be a gamble, a very dangerous gamble in a very sensitive region for dubious political reasons. The diplomatic solution should always be the paramount one, both to hold responsible a regime that's responsible for violations of international rules, but above all for coming up with a solution to the conflict. So more than emotion, we need to address all of the protagonists, particularly in the entire region. It's a dramatically complex civil war, so we need to have a realistic, inclusive and intensive response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lambsdorff has a blue card. Can you accept, Mr. Lambsdorff?
sans la pression militaire des États-Unis.
Without the US military pressure, do you really think that we'd be talking about political options and alternatives today? Without that pressure, we wouldn't have seen the things moving as they did, I think, in the Syrian regime.
Je suis tout à fait d'accord.
Dear colleague, I will willingly accept that the threat of military action has a role to play in terms of bringing pressure to bear and of being a deterrent. But what I reject is the strategy that's been attached to what have been described as punitive strikes. I can't conceive of effective punitive strikes in a context where we've got no political solution that we're putting forward for the day after. This is not an experiment. This is a very sensitive region, and we don't know what the consequences of such strikes would be. We might call them punitive, others would call them aggressive.
Mr. ROUČEK.
Thank you, President. Madam Ashton, colleagues, for the last 2 years, a civil war is going on in Syria. As a result of that civil war, we have 100,000 deaths, 2 million refugees outside of Syria, more than 4 million people who are internally displaced. On 21st of August, chemical weapons were used. So these are the 3 aspects we have to deal with. As far as the chemical weapons are used, my groups, we fully support the move by Baroness Ashton and the solution she proposed. At the end, yes, Syria should put all her chemical weapons under international control and sign the international treaty. As far as the civil war is concerned, I'm also afraid there is no military solution to that conflict, because it's not the bad guy who is in the power fighting some sort of freedom fighters, Free Syrian Army, united opposition. That's unfortunately not the case. We have to deal with with hundreds of groups which are fighting Assad. Some of the groups don't share our values, mildly to say. So in other words, yes, there have to be political and diplomatic solution. As been already mentioned, yes, all relevant actors should be involved, including the major players in the region, including Iran. And as far as the refugees are concerned, we should engage the international community, not only the EU, but also our friends in the United States and our friends in the Arab countries. Thank you.
Herzlichen Dank. Herr Graham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Graham Watson.
High Representative, congratulations on such a strong statement from Vilnius on the basis of such a weak consensus among member states. If any development shows how weak our member states are on their own and how much we now need a common policy to regain influence in the world, it is our impotence in the face of Assad's almost certain use of chemical weapons. Almost 100 years after the use of poison gas on our continent, we have, rightly, UN conventions to prohibit their use. Those conventions establish the basis for action. So yes, use the UN apparatus. Yes, encourage Russia to engage. Yes, keep up your efforts for Geneva too. But no, don't leave it at that. If those avenues fail, act. Because otherwise it will happen again and again and again, and not only in Syria.
Thank you very much. Frau Sargentini.
Dank u, voorzitter. Het debat hier in het Britse lagerhuis in het Amerikaans congres.
Thank you, President. This debate, like the debate in the at Westminster and in the US Congress about what's to be done about Syria, should we have a military intervention and what would the consequences of that be, is a very major debate. It's a matter of weighing advantages and disadvantages, and nobody has a final answer. That's what the press says too. But there's also the question as to what to be done about the large numbers of Syrian refugees, and the debate on that is less sincere, I would say. The first refugees are arriving in Germany now. That's good news for the 100-odd who will be arriving there, and the same goes for Lebanon, Turkey and Jordan, but these are very small numbers. The Netherlands are talking about possibly welcoming 50 refugees, but within the framework of our annual quota. So that will be fewer than, for example, from Kenya. So that's one thing we could do, is welcome the most vulnerable refugees into the EU.
Please. Please, the question.
Sehr geehrte Frau Kollegin.
Dear colleague, are you aware that Germany is accepting 100 additional refugees today? So it's already 17,000 Syrian refugees. These are beyond the normal quota of refugees, and they will be given immediately permission to work and live in the country. So far, we have taken up half of the refugees.
Mag ik mijn collega feliciteren met die...
I'd like to congratulate my colleague and through her country, and the same goes for Sweden. It is somewhat distressing to have to talk about figures, but I use the figures to underscore the problem which does exist in my country. We could do better. With regard to these Syrian refugees, so I'm launching that appeal, and I'm glad to accept the correction that I've been told.
Unusually, I must say, I find myself actually agreeing with much that Baroness Ashton had to say in her statement. Modest, no EU hubris, or a desperate search for some sort of EU role. The harsh fact is that dictators such as Bashar Assad only understand force. And as many colleagues have pointed out, it was only the threat of the use of force that has forced action and broken the political deadlock. The Russian proposal clearly has some merit and some traction, but we should be under no illusions. It was cooked up in Moscow between the Russian and Syrian foreign ministers. It's been effective in delaying military action by the US and her allies, and the danger is that Assad will merely continue to use a full range of weapons short of WMD to press home his military advantage. I mean, yesterday, for example, Syrian aircraft, government aircraft, staged 3 raids over rebel-held areas of Damascus. The war goes on. It seems to me, Mr. Chairman, that we need to press for an immediate ceasefire and that chemical weapons be brought under international control. And may I just say, the key issue is that agreements and international conventions have to be enforced, and therefore we need to give full support to the United States in her endeavours.
Thank you. I have 2 blue cards. But I take one. Mr. Griffin, you are one of the... No, Mr. Griffin, you are one of the next speaker. So I am starting with Mr. Arlacchi Pino, and you can... you have the speech after them.
Mr. Van Orden, you say, and I agree, dictators only understand force or threat of force. So, the other dictators left after Assad, what if, instead of being discouraged by an attack, they will start doing exactly the opposite, going into the nuclear game, providing them nuclear weapons, just as a way to be sure not to be attacked? Thank you.
I mean, I don't recoil at all from my statement. Quite clearly, these people only understand the threat of force, but that threat of force has to be credible. And that is the problem which I think we have at the moment, because there had been a threat, and now we seem rather unsure about whether or not we can use it. And that is the great problem. So I think we should be under no illusions that people like Assad and other dictators will only understand that, and they've got to know that we mean it. And that's why I say we've got to give every possible support to the United States, because after all, the United Nations has shown itself incapable of making sure that conventions and international agreements are properly implemented.
Danke vielmals, Mr. Belder Bastia.
Dank u wel, meneer de voorzitter.
Thank you, Mr. President. This morning, I watched a video of the funeral of 3 Syrians in a town of Muslim pilgrimage, for Muslims and Christians, in fact. Now, the inhabitants of this town have the choice between converting to Islam or being beheaded, which I find worrying. And what is really worrying is the position of the EU and the candidate country Turkey with regard to this type of religious activity. The jihadists are still carrying on their activities, and Lady Ashton and Brussels still support rebels in spite of the fact that they are in fact terrorists. You have a major responsibility in this Syrian drama.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a request. We are running half an hour late. It has been such a hectic debate, but I didn't want to do anything at an earlier stage, but I think we do have to look at the clock, and we have to be more restrictive now, because we also have a number of speakers on the Catch the Eye. Mr. Griffin is the next speaker now.
Mr. President, having spoken in Damascus with many relatives of victims of the Islamist war on Syria, I hope that we all welcome the Russian proposal to put chemical weapons beyond use without an escalation of the conflict. We should do everything possible to help this diplomacy succeed, because if it falters, Obama, Hollande, Cameron and the other neocon puppets will drag us into a conflict that is certain to spiral out of control. Obama claims there will be no boots on the ground. That is a lie, because if the US bombs Syria into the clutches of Al-Qaeda, then Syria's chemical weapons stockpile will end up in the hands not of United Nations decommissioning teams, but of the heirs of Osama bin Laden. American, British and European troops will then have to be sent in to try to secure those weapons, and our soldiers will die in Syria in order to stop children dying in Islamist poison gas attacks, not just in Damascus, but in Paris, London and New York. And that's why we should turn the Russian peace proposal into reality. Thank you.
Herr Vizepräsident Protasiewicz.
Vice President Protasiewicz.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie przewodniczący, pani wysoka przedstawiciel.
Thank you, President. High Representative. The dramatic crisis in Syria should not be seen from a purely military viewpoint. We should also bear in mind the humanitarian dimension of this. There are 2 million refugees, that's 10% of the population, and hundreds of thousands of dead. So there is a full-fledged humanitarian crisis there, and we know that around 2 million children have been affected by the consequences of this civil war, either directly or indirectly. So I believe that an international reaction is a necessity. Bashar al-Assad needs to be held responsible for his acts. However, I believe that if a diplomatic solution is possible, that should be what is done, but the threat of military action needs to be there so that pressure is still brought to bear. Nonetheless, I think that the most important point from our viewpoint is humanitarian aid, and the 400,000 that were offered in June may not be enough.
A resolução que o Parlamento vai adotar amanhã.
In the resolution to be adopted by Parliament tomorrow, there's a message that the use of chemical weapons and the massacre of innocent civilians cannot be tolerated. Bringing the criminals responsible to an international court is the very least that can be done, and that goes for the those supplying the substances, well, the crime that has taken place shows that the regime won't hesitate, won't stop at anything. Now, Russia has a responsibility here in its links with Syria, and it should be protecting the people against the regime that's attacking them. 100,000 dead, 2 million refugees, more than 5 million people displaced, but Russia and China still have the responsibilities they had 2 years ago. What Damascus has done of late must generate results. There must be consequences, otherwise the very principles of the United Nations Charter will be under threat, as we state in our resolution. Assad has to be forced to hand over his chemical arsenal and destroy it, and to bring an end to the conflict. And we should never forget that if there are to be results, everybody needs to sit around the same table, including the regional partners, including Iran. We have the moral obligation to prevent this recurring elsewhere in the country. If the United Nations Security Council gets stalemated, we have to go to the Assembly to get a solution. And I would wind up by saying that it's not baddies against baddies in Syria. There's a people that rose up against a regime that was oppressing it, and this is what we have to bear in mind as well.
Herr Lambsdorff.
Mr. Lambsdorff. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Lady Ashton, I would like to support those who have congratulated you, because you have in the Union got everybody to support a declaration. And the question is now what to do. Mr. Westerwelle feels that we need to take action. Maybe if we could encourage Syria to join the convention, and that we should prepare the Geneva II Convention. And of course, I also think that the International Criminal Court should be prepared for cases concerning this crime against humanity. What can we do in Europe? Somebody's mentioned something. We can deal with these refugees alongside a political process. I think it would be a good initiative if in Europe we called for an international refugee conference. It shouldn't be a burden on just a few specific countries. I think we should show solidarity in this situation, and I don't think that any member state should be allowed to withdraw from this responsibility, and I think that this is an initiative I would like to see you take. Thank you. Thank you very much to you. Mrs. Lochweiler.
Danke, Herr Präsident. Thank you, Mr. President. Lady Ashton, I very much welcome the proposal that the chemical weapons of Syria should be put under international control, and this is something we call on them to do unreservedly. But of course, this dreadful attack with chemical weapons of the 21st of August is something we condemn, and all member states must ensure that this is discussed and taken up at the International Court of Justice. We have to see who is responsible for this crime, because there can be no impunity. The European Union needs to redouble its efforts to ensure that we combat further spread of the use of chemical weapons. We need a ban on enriched uranium and phosphates, because these are horrific weapons. The drama of the Syrian refugees has been mentioned several times. Sweden has been exemplary and said it is ready to take in refugees, as Mrs. Malmström has said, and other member states should follow suit and bear also their responsibilities here.
Mr. President, either we have a responsibility to protect, as we define in the United Nations in 2006 and beyond, or we don't have a responsibility to protect. And therefore we can allow people to happily kill each other while we watch. For 2 years we watched, and 2 million refugees, 6 million displaced, 100,000 dead, we watched. Why did we watch? Because we knew that the Syrian opposition had Al-Qaeda embedded within them, and we did not want Al-Qaeda to win. We let Arab kill Arab, moderate kill jihadists, Sunni kill Shia, none of our business. but a red line was crossed with chemical weapons. And therefore we realized that it has gone beyond what we could control. And here I can congratulate Baroness Ashton on her very timely intervention to try and pull the rearing horses back and to see the horses of the accomplice not happening again. But we have to decide, do we have a responsibility to protect, as the international community has said before, or we do not?
Thank you very much. Herr Alam. Not here. Mr. Mitchell.
Mr. President, I just want to make 3 quick points. First of all, can I thank Baroness Ashton and Commissioner Georgieva for the work they've done to date. Secondly, can I say there must be an inquiry. The international community must cause a formal inquiry into what happened on the 21st of August in relation to chemical weapons which killed 1,400 people. Whatever else happens, that must be inquired into. Secondly, we must ensure that the humanitarian aid that is required is provided and that we meet our part in that. Now, I know to date we have been doing that and in part meeting it from the neighbourhood instrument, which brings me to my 3rd point. Do we remember Srebrenica? Who was it sorted out the problem in Srebrenica? Here this is in our neighbourhood, being funded by our neighbourhood humanitarian aid facility in part, and we do not have the capacity to deal with this. We leave it to the Russians or the Americans, which is why the question of a common defence needs to be revisited. That may sound a strange thing coming from someone who represents a neutral country, but I've set my views out in a document called Beyond Neutrality. We need to have that debate. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Frau Koppa.
Thank you, Mr. President. On the 21st of August, before our eyes, a crime against humanity took place, the use of chemical weapons against unarmed civilians in any place is contradictory with humanitarian law and international law. This goes beyond conflict, and it is risking bringing further instability to a region which is already unstable. What can be done? There's no clear evidence as to who is responsible for this attack. Secondly, there is no clear target for any possible intervention. Thirdly, there are no clear allies for the forces to intervene. We see divisions, and this has given rise to further extremism, Al-Qaeda and others. We will also see, as a result of such an intervention, further flows of refugees, and finally there's no legal basis for such an attack because we don't have a decision or resolution from the United Nations Security Council or any other body. Public opinion tends to be against such an intervention. So what we have to do at all costs is to find a solution politically. And now we have a possibility whereby all members, including permanent members of the Security Council, can work towards the Geneva II initiative. Through diplomacy, we need to provide support for displaced persons and refugees. This is a dramatic, uncontrolled situation. We have to take action immediately, give humanitarian aid, and we need some kind of plan at the European level to deal with the refugees coming to Europe so that those countries that are at the borders to the European Union will not have to bear a huge burden with regard to these refugees.
Thank you.
High Representative, we must welcome the opportunity to explore a UN-supported deal to end the use of chemical weapons by Assad. Yet many major problems remain. A humanitarian disaster, the growth of terrorist and extremist militia, regional fragility and the risk of spillover, and the malfunctioning of the UN Security Council to uphold agreed principles. We cannot allow for Assad to see meeting demands on chemical weapons as a license to kill by other means. That has been the status quo for the past 2.5 years. The war is not over, and Syria has become the bloody theatre of major geopolitical power play. Let's not be naive. The EU ought to play a more prominent and strategic role, a leading role, by acting as a global player. We can do more to end death and to defend the universal values the EU stands for. We cannot allow Russia and the United States to act over our heads while the EU is fragmented, weak, risks losing relevance and is incapable because we lack our own military capacity. High Representative Ashton, I would like to ask you what role for the EU in going forward? What are your plans on diplomacy? Are you intending to talk about Syria with Iran? What can we do to avoid a regional spillover, specifically in Lebanon, for example by adding more troops to the UN mandate there? What pressure can we apply? How can we uphold the responsibility to protect and reform the UN Security Council? These are some ideas in which the EU can take a much stronger lead. Thank you.
Danke, Frau.
Thank you. Mrs. de Mismarker.
Ja, dank u voorzitter. Collega's, bijna...
Thank you very much, President. Colleagues. Well, in the First World War 100 years ago, they were using chemical weapons also in my home country, and therefore it is terrible to see what's happening in Syria. The truth is that we still do not have a clear response vis-à-vis this kind of barbarian action, and not in a complicated conflict such as we see in Syria. If we take military action, we are going to realize that sooner or later we're going to be in a situation where we have to follow up on our threats. Therefore, I think what we need is a mandate without military action. That is, and it does not have the public support, and therefore in this conflict I don't think that we would make sense if we did that, even though what should happen, and we would see a chain reaction also in the reaction. Therefore we must use diplomacy first and foremost, and then we must negotiate against the chemical weapons. Thank you.
Mr. Shodro.
Przewodniczący, usiłuje nam się przedstawić od dłuższego czasu takie klisze czarno-białe co do oceny sytuacji.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, we're painting things black and white, but it's hardly the case. It's far more complicated than that. There are so many layers that have to be taken into account in this conflict. Shiites, Sunnis, Christian communities. This oversimplified presentation of the situation, depiction of the situation, in the eyes of the West and Turkey as well, doesn't reflect reality. And we have to think about whether our action is going to bring further stabilization or destabilization. I think it's the latter. I condemn Assad's actions, but I'm not sure whether the post-Assad phase will bring greater stability. Perhaps it will bring greater anarchy. We have Al-Qaeda organizations waging the jihad on behalf of Islam, which will continue.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mr. Vidal Quadras.
Thank you, President. Mrs. Ashton, as you know very well, under the cover of the conflict in Syria that is concentrating the attention of the Western governments and public opinion, the Iraqi government has initiated the final phase of physical liquidation of the 3,000 members of the Iranian democratic opposition that reside in Iraq. In relation to this, I ask you to do immediately the following things. Tell Prime Minister Maliki that if there is another murder or the 7 hostages are not freed, this will be severe consequences on diplomatic, financial and political level for him, and we will take him to respond of these crimes in an international court. Organize with the United Nations a blue helmet protection for Ashraf and call for an urgent meeting of foreign affairs ministers of the Union to accept refugees in their countries. Anything less than that is a waste of time.
And the next speaker is Mr. Howard.
President, the events of the last 24 hours mean that we're not debating the provenance of chemical weapons, but the provenance of their disposal. From Northern Ireland in my own country to what the European Union itself did in Indonesia, to what Germany and others are doing today in Libya, there is a wealth of international experience to verify decommissioning. The credibility of the Russian offer will now depend on the validity of the decommissioning process. For me, that means it being undertaken within a United Nations framework and in the context of a UN resolution which enables the international community to coalesce towards ending all crimes against humanity and war crimes in Syria. My party, Britain's Labour Party, did conclude that Prime Minister Cameron had failed to make the case for military action. Yes, of course, lessons had to be learnt about Iraq. But it is this week's events in Syria which show the foolishness of prematurely ending the work of weapons inspectors when their work has just got very much bigger. I recognise that... I think I've got 30 seconds.
Herr Kollege, no. Sie sind...
No, I'm sorry. You've already overshot by 30 seconds.
And now we have 2 minutes 30. For Giannakou.
Chairman.
Please rule against if it's not right, but I think you'll find the clock wasn't reset and I have 30 seconds more to go. I say that in all honesty to you, sir.
Dann sprechen Sie.
Well, in that case, I'll allow you to conclude.
Thank you. Finally, the prospect of military action not simply caused desperately needed humanitarian workers to be removed from the country, but also alienated some in the MENA region and amongst the BRIC countries who are most needed to meet their pledges for humanitarian assistance. Europe must lead the argument for the UN appeal to be met in full, using this month's annual meeting of the UNHCR as a real opportunity to do so. Food will run out next month. Already the size of food parcels has been made smaller. Our ambition should be to prevent chemical attacks, but at one and the same time to secure peace.
Thank you
very much, and apologies for that technical hitch. The next speaker is Mrs. Giannakou.
Chairman, the conflict in Syria that we follow in terror gives to both sides the possibility to make acts outside every limit. There is no doubt that chemical weapons were used, but in that region they have been used again. They were used in 1988 by Iraq in the war against Iran, because chemical weapons finally are the weapons of the poor, as it seems. What will Europe do? And what democracy will do? Chairman, Syria is not Kosovo. In order to program an attack, that will remain an aerial attack and we will not have troops on the ground. It's a very big country. The conflict is very complicated and it turns out of control constantly. We need to select a political solution. We should follow the road of pressure. We should have a pressure that an attack might happen, but substantially we have to make the policy prevail, like Lady Ashton said, and we have to address the humanitarian problem.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mrs. Trautmann. Thank you. Thank you, President. High Representative, colleagues. We all agree that we need to find a political solution, but I've listened carefully to this debate, and it seems to me that if a political solution had been possible previously, we would have found it. Military dissuasion or deterrence has allowed us to at least pool our resources now, our efforts, and I would like to thank you, Baroness Ashton. Thank you for speaking out with a clear, loud voice in Vilnius. Thank you also for bringing all the EU member states together. That's a step in the right direction, and you've stated that yet again here today. We have to remember that there are states who've tried to do whatever they can with regard to the UN Security Council, because they're responsible for security and peace throughout the world, try to get some kind of response, bearing in mind that the crimes committed are simply atrocious. There has been use of chemical weapons, and that is overstepping a line. With our resolution, we would like to send out a message, a clear message on behalf of the international community. We need to have political measures, we need to have diplomatic measures. Without these, I'm afraid we'll not be able to come to any kind of result. Of course, these problems have existed before the use of chemical weapons, and they can continue to do so afterwards. But precisely for that reason, the EU needs to step up to the plate and get a resolution from the UN. Thank you. The next speaker, Mrs. Ria Oomen-Ruijten.
Dank u, meneer de voorzitter. Mag ik mij aansluiten bij de complimenten die...
Thank you. If I may, I would like to join the words of congratulation to Baroness Ashton. It's been a difficult period, and she's succeeded in bringing together the countries of Europe, and I think that is merit-worthy. In terms of this discussion, President, I think a visit to the refugee camps springs to my mind when one of the refugees said to me, when is the international community going to do away with this killing machine that's killing tens of thousands of people, millions of people are fleeing, what is the international community doing? This refugee said to me. People who are fleeing turn to us. They place their hopes in us. I'm against intervention. I think we should give diplomacy a chance, and I believe in using a UN resolution to try to do something to ensure that there is a possibility to act if these commitments are not respected.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Het gebruik van chemische wapens in het Syrisch conflict is een nieuw triest.
Thank you, Mr. President. The use of chemical weapons in the Syria conflict is a further desperate chapter in this sorry tale. All of us are deeply concerned and want these dreadful weapons destroyed. Every day, dozens, hundreds of people, in total hundreds of thousands of people, are being killed or driven out of the country. This is causing new tensions. We should seize the opportunity to force a political solution, to bring the parties to the negotiating table, and the EU must play a lead role. The only way to bring an end to this conflict is via diplomacy.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Kukan.
Thank you, Mr. President. The use of chemical weapons against a civilian population is a red line which no regime should cross. That red line has been crossed in Syria. Thus, a crime against humanity has been committed. That cannot be accepted by the international community and requires a resolute response. The regime and the people responsible for the use of chemical weapons must be brought to justice. The violence must be stopped. The further use of chemical weapons must be stopped. I think there can be such a solution without the use of force, and the European Union will help to find a diplomatic and political resolution to the crisis. However, the starting point must be the reality of the situation. Syria has become part of a wider strategic conflict that is devastating for the whole region. Russia must be made to behave responsibly in the current crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mr. Panzeri.
Thank you. I would like to address you directly, Baroness Ashton, because with only 1 minute, there's no time for niceties. We've been told that there's something new on the table, the Russian proposal. We have to look into it, but this may be an opportunity to open up some negotiating room. Nonetheless, even if there is this new element that means that military intervention will be postponed, this doesn't mean that the civil war, which is currently underway, has been resolved. So I feel we should go beyond words. We need proposals and actions going beyond Vilnius. If we want a diplomatic initiative to be fruitful, then it's not a question of having a threat of military intervention in the background. We need to ensure that Europe is playing the necessary role and being proactive rather than following in the wake of others. So I'd like to ask you to ask US, Russia, China to put together an intervention force that will be able to stop the current situation in the field and lead to a peace conference. And I would ask you to be more aware of the potential for the EU to play an active role.
Thank you, Mr. Lisek.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Madam High Representative, I too am one of those who would like to thank your services for your intervention and action. It is extremely significant that the European Union has become active in this context. Colleagues have already talked about what needs to be done for Syria in future, such as bringing the users of chemical weapons to justice. But above all, this appalling war must be stopped. It is costing hundreds of thousands of lives, and a military action on the part of the Assad regime and some of the rebel forces must be stopped. We shall continue to support you. We believe the Security Council is the right place for this to be resolved. It's a litmus test for the ability of Russia and the international community to behave.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mrs. Muniz de Urquiza.
Yes, President.
Thank you very much, President. My party is in favour of international legality, and that is what we proved, in fact, with regard to the Iraq war. We wanted decisions that would be in conformity with international legality. A crime against humanity cannot go unanswered, but we have to come up with a response which is lawful. Therefore, we have to turn to the UN, because they have the resources in order to take measures, for instance, at the level of the Security Councils. It is important, therefore, to turn to the UN to find out exactly who used chemical weapons, and indeed where these chemical weapons are. It's not the secret services of our countries that should be entrusted with this, but the UN. Mrs. Ashton, 24 hours before the occasion when 28 member states of the European Union signed this declaration, the Vilnius Declaration, 24 hours before that there were 5 member states of the EU who also met and who signed a different document where they said that they would be in favour of a military intervention. And they said that this was necessary because the world could not actually wait for never-ending proceedings before the UN. Now, Baroness Ashton, we need coordination for the European Union. We need to, of course, bring coordination into humanitarian assistance, but we nevertheless are talking about 5 member states who opted for a different tack. The President interrupts the Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Rotter.
Frau Kratzer.
Mrs. Kratzer?
Frau Kratzer. Bitte, Herr.
I do apologize, Mrs. Kratzer.
Kratzer. Frau Kratzer.
Thank you very much, Chairman. The drama in Syria coincides with the destruction of a country and a people, and it's at a crucial stage. That's why we have to act in a more coordinated and efficient way as an international community, at least as a European Union. Today, we wonder, is the proposal for destruction of chemical weapons convincing? For controlling the regime of Assad, we need the control by the United Nations for the destruction, the commissioning of these weapons. Can we implement the solution? The specialists say that for the whole procedure we will need at least 10 years. Is the proposal sufficient to reduce the aggressivity of the regime? Nothing can convince us for that. 2 things are certain. First, that the regime will be upgraded in the diplomatic chessboard, and second, the drama of the people is going to continue. The European Union gives the largest amounts of money, and it will continue in that direction to help the people in Syria and the refugees. But we should take a political initiative as well in order to help to find a viable solution, political solution.
Next speaker, Mr. Kaiserslautern.
Colleagues, it is to be welcomed that there is now a way out of the Syrian impasse. I hope that Russia will succeed in bringing an end to this war. How honest the Syrians are about destroying their chemical weapons is questionable. It's unrealistic in the absence of a ceasefire. I'm not sure if Assad and his adversaries are ready to go into this process, Lady Ashton. And in the absence of an agreement, how is anyone going to respond to the use of noxious gases in this war? People are being killed, mutilated. Terrible things are being done to people using conventional weapons, which of course are legitimate. There must be an end to this horror. Pressure must be brought to bear. There is no military solution.
Madame la Haute Représentante, nous en sommes.
High Representative, we are aware of the fact that the EU does have a role to play here. We've shown our commitment to Syrians through humanitarian aid, and we have a long-term commitment. What we need is a complete political solution that will not distract attention away from what happened on the 21st of August. So we need to play our role, and those who are saying that we need targeted and rapid action should bear in mind that that will not be sufficient. I think you have realised that, Baroness Ashton, and I congratulate you on that we need to ensure that there is an international inspection of chemical weapons with a reliable list, including the location of such arms. In the absence of that, it will be difficult to ensure that if such a mission is to be carried out in a country in civil war, that we can ensure the safety of the inspectors. We also need to ensure that there is a message sent to EU states, particularly border countries, that we will be able to help the neighbouring countries with the flow of Syrian refugees and have the courage to help come up with the right answers.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mr. Iacolino.
Signor Presidente, signora
President, Baroness Ashton, EU defence policy is linked to security policy and our relations with third countries. It may be true that to some extent we are no longer looking at immediately going into bombings, but as of the 21st of August we were talking about a crime on such a scale that we must condemn it. So what is left? A political solution, a dialogue, trying to protect Syrian citizens, with 45,000 refugees already having come to Europe and many others on the way, which is adding to the migration flows that we're already seeing from the region. So we need to provide support for dialogue. We also need to provide assistance to southern European EU member states who are the victims of this, and provide them with assistance to deal with these significant migratory flows.
Colleagues, we're behind schedule, and in addition to that, at 5:15, the Vice President of the Commission has to leave the chamber. But of course she also has to be there for the next item on our agenda to speak and to listen to questions. And I have, I think, 16 people on my list for Catch the Eye. So please, may I beg your indulgence, I will reduce that to 8, if I may. In other words, from each political group, if somebody has asked for the floor, well, I'll take one speaker. And I will do that also in order to make sure that we respect proportions in this House. The first speaker, Mr. Mikolášik.
Please.
Mr. Mikolášik.
Time.
Yes. Danke schön, Herr Vorsitzender. Drahá pani.
Thank you, Mr. President. Esteemed Lady Ashton, there are a number of facts we need to bear in mind. 2 million refugees, 6 million internally displaced, and there is no end to the killing and the deaths. The opposition, the rebels, have offered no guarantees that they will behave as a democratic government in future. In Egypt, we supported the opposition. I'm not saying that was wrong, but what was the first thing they did? They started persecuting Christians in Egypt. Christians are the first victims in this conflict between Muslims. However, I'd like to congratulate the EU for allocating the money it has to resolving the conflict.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Jaakonsaari is the next speaker.
Kiitos puheenvuorosta.
Thank you. The killing absolutely has to stop. We need a plan for the refugees, and I'm sure the EU will do what it can. But we have to think deeper. How is it possible? How is it going to be possible for the UN Security Council, NATO, and the European Union to resolve these questions? Why are the international institutions failing? The United States act as global policemen, but it's hardly their fault because nobody else is up to the job. The EU has to beef up its crisis management capacity, but above all, the killing must stop.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Mr. Ivo Feigl.
Danke, Herr Vorsitzender.
I would like to join in with all the speakers who have expressed thanks to Lady Ashton for her very reasonable managing of these hard problems, and also for stressing the priorities, that is the political solution of the matter. We have extended these actions maybe for too long a while because we could not find a proper political solution to be acceptable for all the sides involved. Only the use of chemical weapons has started the initiative for a military response, which is maybe the right thing to do if there is no political solution possible. I think that the European Union should use the knowledge that is available to us, the tradition that we have, and we should involve all the capable actors in the solution.
Madame.
Thank you. Mrs. Benaratou.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President. Madam Vice President, yes to a humanitarian corridor in Syria, and we want it now. And yes also to the welcoming of many refugees into the European Union. But remember that in 2009 there was an operation led by the Israeli regime. These were attacks on Palestinians. Phosphorus bombs were used and uranium as well, and yet no sanction was taken then. No sanctioning of those who had taken these measures. There was no justice delivered. Nothing until this very day. So we're talking about double standards, and that means that we as Europeans lack legitimacy. And also, of course, if you look at the state of Israel, they claim to be the flag bearers of democracy and international rights. It's simply not credible, and therefore, Lady Ashton, I would expect you to really make sure that by the end of 2013 we are able to bring together this conference, a conference which has been postponed time and time again, a conference where we could talk about these weapons of mass destruction and how we deal with them. That is the only way of dealing with this problem, because chemical weapons, nuclear weapons are so dangerous wherever they might be deployed, whether it's Syria, whether it's Israel. May I therefore count on you, Mrs. Ashton, in accordance with the speech you gave during the course of this summer? Thank you.
Merci. Mr.
Thank you. The next speaker, Mr. Toussas.
The people react to the imperialist intervention of the United States, the member states of the European Union against Syria, which would create a big danger of a general war in the area. The European Union has a big responsibility, but it imposed economic sanctions on Syria. It recognized the opposition as official interlocutors and facilitated their arming with the decision of the foreign ministers on the 28th of May of 2013, opening the road of a military intervention against Syria. Which people could accept the geopolitical interest of the United States, of the European Union, and of the monopolies to control the resources and the transport routes of the resources, that all these reasons can make them decide what is legal and what is not? The people do not accept the imperialist strategy of the United States and of their partners. Chairman, I would like to show some understanding, please. Give me a few seconds, because it's a very serious issue, and I would like to raise a very serious point, Chairman. I would like you to show some understanding. To abuse children.
Even for communists. Kollege, Sie haben Ihre Zeit.
I'm afraid you've overshot your speaking time by a long shot, in fact, so please stop.
Mölzer, bitte.
Next speaker, Mr. Mölzer.
Das nun im Konflikt Syriens
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm sure we're all glad that something is being done about the use of ABC weapons in Syria. A military solution would have set the whole region on fire. Russia is able to strut on the global diplomatic stage, and it's questionable how much support President Obama would have had for military action. Implementation of the current plan could become very problematic. The Assad regime is well known as a master of the delaying tactic. It's also not quite clear how the weapons are going to be destroyed or removed from Syria. So a great deal will have to be done to put this plan into reality.
Madame Korhola.
Next speaker, Mrs. Korhola.
Madame Korhola.
Moni on varmaankin kuullut Obaman viimeys.
I'm sure many people have heard the Obama speech on Syria. Obama is polite and has given diplomacy a chance. I would ask the international community to behave sensibly. We shouldn't blindly support any old opposition. We should lend help to those whose weapon is the pen and the law. Civil society representatives are the first to be imprisoned in Syria. Many of them have had to flee the country. They are now blogging. They should be allowed to draft the new constitution, not Islamists whose democratic credentials are questionable. Help the Syrian refugees. That's my message.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sophocleos.
100,000 dead, 2 million refugees, and diplomacy has failed. Where did you see the international community united? The truth is very tough. The European Union without a unified voice, the European Parliament, the European Union should not tolerate a military intervention. We should give time to diplomacy. The United States should not support themselves on the European Union. A war would be destructive for Syria, the Arab world. We will have terrorist acts in the European Union and the United States. Assad is a dictator. He should leave only through diplomacy and through the will of the Syrian people. And for the use of chemical weapons, we should condemn that. We should condemn the use. We should demand the destruction of the weapons. Many contradicting things have been written. I wonder why we do not have a reply by the specialist with proofs. Decisions are taken with proofs, not with indications and suspicions, no matter how serious they are and where they come from. Thank you.
Please, wir beschließen die Aussprache.
Very well, and we shall conclude that debate with the words of Baroness Ashton, Vice President.
Thank you, Mr. President.
First of all, honourable members, there's no question that the proposal that has been put forward to remove or destroy or put under observation the chemical weapons needs, first of all, to be verified. Verified in the sense of ensuring that the Assad regime is determined on its implementation. And as honourable members have said, that needs to be both in the meeting that will take place tomorrow and in our discussions, verified and ensured, in order that this is not a delaying tactic or anything other than an opportunity to help protect the people in Syria. Secondly, it is important that the UN inspectors complete their work. Their report, we believe, will be available over the next days, and that will be an opportunity for everyone to see what happened and for greater verification to take place about the event. It will be an important moment as that report is put before the UN Security Council. I have indeed been talking with many countries, including Iran, on the issues of chemical weapons and on the issues of how we move forward in a diplomatic process to a conference that will bring together all those who are able to help stop the fighting and move forward to a resolution that can be peaceful. Honourable members had before me the debate that I've seen so many times in so many places about military action. The questions about humanitarian corridors, the questions about no-fly zones, how to enforce that, how to achieve that. And I have to tell you that in all the conversations with the military experts that I've spoken to, again in many countries, we know this is not something that is passive but active. This is not something that could be done easily. Most importantly, we don't see that this is going to be on the agenda any time soon, as it has not been on the agenda over these past 2 years. But I don't want any misinterpretation that says that not to have military action is somehow to be passive. There is a huge amount of work going on all the time, meetings with so many different groups from Syria, efforts being made to bring together the international community in a common position that can put the kind of political pressure necessary to be able to bring people together in order to try and resolve this. And the reason to do that, as so many honourable members have said, is for the millions of Syrians who are suffering every single day, who see their lives shattered, their families destroyed, their homes in ruins. And that is why it is very difficult for anyone to imagine that a government that fails to be able to protect its people and indeed is complicit in murdering its people can continue. That does not suggest that there are not challenges for the future about building a peace process that will allow all communities to be part of the future of Syria and to ensure that the values that brought the people originally out in demonstrations to the government 2 years ago, that those values must be the values upon which the new Syria rises from the ashes. Without that, we will have failed the people of Syria, many of whom, the vast majority of whom, want this war to end, want to find a peaceful way forward, and want to live in the kind of free societies that we enjoy. And that's also, of course, important when you think about the context of refugees. Honourable members have spoken about the need for member states to think about their responsibilities. We think about all the time the 2 million people. It's a huge number of people who are now outside of their country. And frankly, the best way we can help them is to help them to be able to go home. And that means finding a way to end this war and to support the rebuilding of their country. To support the refugees, I am pleased, I am proud that between us all, we are the biggest donor of humanitarian aid. I don't honestly think anybody here disagrees that that is fundamentally important. But we need to do more, and that becomes very obvious when you, like me, have visited the refugee camps and see the plight, see the importance of getting schools to function for children, seeing the real importance of ensuring that people have opportunity to do things and to feel that they will have a future where they can engage in their own country in the political process. It also means we think about the displaced people whose lives are miserable within the country and again who need to be helped and supported as much as possible. And I've referred to the challenges of trying to get aid into the country, challenges we have to face but we have to overcome for their sake. Any process is going to have to be led and developed through the United Nations, but it's going to have within it the people who can bring this war to an end. That means it is about trying to put the right kind of programme together to build the support from all nations who have a stake in this, from all nations who have a way in which they can ensure that peace comes and it lasts. And we do play our part and we will play our part. That doesn't mean I'm naive about what that role is, but it does mean it's an important one. And it's important because day after day we get messages from so many countries, organisations and people to ask us to help to do the things that we do well, and that we will commit to do. Finally, honourable members, I want to respond on Camp Ashraf because Vice President Vidal Quadras and Mrs Salafranca raised that. And it is very important. And this morning I left the chamber because I was talking to the Iraqi Foreign Minister about exactly the two issues. One, the importance of ensuring that people are protected properly. And the terrible massacre that we saw on the 1st of September where 52 people have died. The inquiry is underway, but I have urged that that be a properly done inquiry. But as importantly, the responsibility of the government to protect the people. And the 7 people who are missing, who are being tracked down as we speak. We have offered our support through the new representative of the United Nations, who I've already met and indeed know well, but also, of course, to support the UN process in any way that we can. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Lady Ashton. Thank you, all colleagues. The debate is closed. The vote is tomorrow at 12 o'clock. We now move to the debate on the situation in Egypt. And when she's ready, once again, I call Lady Ashton, the High Representative.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Honourable members, the last time that I was in this chamber before the summer break, I was on my way to Egypt, and I've been to Egypt 3 times since we last met. This summer has been a summer of contacts and discussion with many countries, but most of all with many people within Egypt. I went then, as I've been ever since, to urge them to go forward towards the democratic future that those who stood up in Tahrir Square and sometimes died in Tahrir Square stood up and said they wanted, stood up and said they believed that this was the right future for their country. I went on that visit when I left this house to see Mohamed Morsi, then in his presidential palace. And I told him that I believed that he and his country were running out of time. It was obvious that the failure to deliver political and economic change to the people of Egypt had led to the prospect of huge demonstrations and civil unrest. My meetings with civil society on that occasion showed how far their alienation was from the government. Not one organisation said anything remotely positive about the situation that they found. Now, honourable members, you know that we had been working for many, many months to support a political solution that would have seen real progress. Progress to be inclusive with the then opposition and to listen to the people, a process that would have helped to ensure a more democratic and more prosperous Egypt. So I left on that occasion with a real deep sense of foreboding. It seemed to me that there was a president who believed that it was enough to be elected, but not someone who understood that democracy demanded much, much more than that. I've been very fortunate in our Special Representative Bernardino Leon, who's built strong ties with all sides of Egyptian political life, and I pay tribute to him for the many, many weeks that he spent in Egypt on my behalf. That meant that when I went back with my director, Christian Berger, we had real access to all of those who were trying to promote a democratic future, to all the key political forces within Egypt. But, honourable members, I want to be absolutely clear. It is our principles that have guided us in our discussions in Egypt. We don't take sides in terms of the choices that people make, but we are very clear. We believe in a constitution that will support democracy. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in justice, and we believe in respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. And those are the messages we have given consistently to Egypt over the last 2 years, in the 11 visits I've made, in the many, many more visits that our Special Representative has made, our colleagues in the Member States have made, that you have made, that so many others have made. These are fundamental principles upon which the country needs to go forward. So when we saw the dramatic changes, I went back to Egypt to press these points to those who then had taken power, to General al-Sisi, to President Mansour, to Vice President el-Baradei then, and to Foreign Minister Fahmy. I talked about the need of inclusivity and the danger, the real danger of excluding parts of society, the need to release political prisoners. I met with the Tamarod young people, the movement who'd collected over 20 million signatures and who'd been fundamentally part of the growing concern that so many people wanted to express. And of course I saw the Freedom and Justice Party on that occasion. But, honourable members, I was asked to go back to Egypt by both international stakeholders, including the United States, and most importantly for me, by the Egyptians themselves. Not to mediate, but to spend time talking with all, to help them to find the elements of an agreement that could help them move forward. At that moment, there was a real fear, and you could feel it, that we would see clashes as the Brotherhood were occupying the squares. We could see there were people who wanted to move against the squares, partly out of fear. There was genuine fear about the build-up of weapons. I saw no evidence of that, but I didn't go into the squares. And, of course, growing concern about the terrorism in Sinai. We worked through, with all of them, the elements of a plan that could build confidence between them, that could ensure that inclusivity, that could strengthen and deepen what I called our value-based approach. And we gave